So we can talk about threats to our water supply, our clean water supply. And one of these actually goes back to our first principle of sustainability, and that is the overuse. So sometimes this is referred to as an overdraft. So this is where we take out water faster than it is replenished. One important example of this is what we refer to as groundwater mining. So you remember that groundwater is not an easily replenished resource. So as we take out water from aquifers, for example, that is much faster than it is ever going to be replenished. And so that's the first principle of sustainability. So what are we using this water for? You'll remember that most of our water is used for agriculture, but we also have now big cities that require lots of water. So municipal uses are also important. So when we look at an example of a water supply that has been depleted or overused, we could look at the Owens Valley in California. So back in the early 1900s, even then, LA realized that it didn't have a sustainable source of water. So what they did is that they bought up water rights way up north in the middle of the valley. And this valley that was once fertile agricultural land has since become a desert. So they created aqueducts, for example, to drain the river and to actually take the river down to California, down to Southern California, to LA. And one of the things that this has done is it's caused the drying up of the lake, Owens Lake. And so now this drying up of the lake has actually become another problem. This is a problem in air pollution. So the dust that forms because of the wind is now a big source of air pollution. And so they're even trying to now get LA to mitigate some of the bad environmental impacts, including the use of all of the water and also the air pollution. If we look at this, another example of this, one of the issues is that when you take water out of groundwater, it can sometimes dry up rivers. So oftentimes the surface water and the groundwater are related to one another. So in this diagram, you can see that if the water table is above the bottom of the river here, the groundwater will actually flow into that area. And so this is an example in Arizona of a river system, a riverine system. And if we deplete the water table and the groundwater through wells, for example, this can cause rivers to completely dry up. So this is just an example of a river that has done that. We can also talk about how when we deplete the groundwater, it actually sometimes causes the land to sink. So this is an example in California where the valley, we can see that this was actually the level of the soil in 1925. And so this is called subsistence. Anyway, so we can see that even in 1977, we can see that the valley is sinking because the groundwater is not supporting the soil. Okay, so that is one example of a threat to water use. Another example is pollution. So this is actually where we have the Clean Water Act, which in its version that we're going to talk about was developed in 1972. And so in 1972, a lot of the waterways were so heavily polluted that fish were dying off, people were getting sick from them. And so the Clean Water Act actually developed a mission statement, and that was to make all navigable waters, and so this would be like with boats, and their tributaries, swimmable, and fishable. So not drinkable, right? But swimmable and fishable. So back in this period of time, 60% of the waterways were not swimmable and they were not fishable. And so we had places where rivers were so filled with pollutants that they even caught fire, right? And so it was crazy to think about this nowadays, because we have strong regulation that prevents our fresh water, our rivers and our streams from being so heavily polluted. So what this means is that it's for recreation, so swimmable. So it needs to make sure that you don't have any really bad toxins in it. And also, like, there's not a lot of bacteria that can make us sick. So like, for example, E. coli. Also, fish are a good sign, having fish in your water are a good sign that there's not other pollutants in there that are causing issues. So we're going to talk about some of these pollutants and what they are. So when we talk about pollution, we could talk about agricultural pollution. What might this be? This is stuff that they put on their crops that then gets into our waters. So this could be fertilizer, like excess nitrogen, like excess phosphorus. It could also be herbicides. So we have discovered that atrazine is an herbicide that when it gets in the water, it actually is an estrogen mimic, and it can actually make problems for some of the animals that live in the water, like, for example, frogs and alligators. Males of those species tend to have underdeveloped testes and penises in the case of the alligators. So herbicides, we need to protect ourselves from that. And then also, just like when we're talking about sewage that is coming off of industrial agricultural feedlots, right? So feedlot sewage would be an example. Okay. The second source of pollution, so this is under pollution, would be wastewater. And this would be like human, right? So this is like sewage from your toilet, from your sink, from your bathtub. And so we have mechanisms in place where we have to treat that sewage. It's not okay to just put raw sewage into a waterway, right? We have to go through a period of treatment plants where they use microbes to break down those waste products. And and that water has to be of a certain quality before it actually gets put back into our rivers and streams. So you think about all these humans on the planet, we produce a lot of waste. Sometimes we have these novel sources of pollution like microplastics. So one of the things that we recently discovered is that laundry and washing your clothes, like your nylon clothes, can actually release these little plastic fibers that then get into our water, and then they get into our food sources. And so that can be a problem, right? Wastewater. Okay, so we also have in industrial processes or industry. So you can't just build an industrial processing plant or manufacturing plant on a river these days and expect to just be able to put your waste right into the river. Industrial processes sometimes produce chemicals that are not easily broken down. And so we have what is referred to as persistent organic pollutants. And so these are synthetic. They are abbreviated as POPs. And some herbicides and pesticides are also persistent organic pollutants. But this could be, for example, the PCBs that were released into our water and now, for example, are still extensively in our food chain. So one example of this would be the fish in the Columbia River having PCBs in their body. Through biological magnification, it gets into the phytoplankton, it gets into the algae, it gets into the smaller fish, and then it works its way up the food chain and it becomes magnified. So this is just an example of PCBs would be an example of persistent organic pollutants. You also might have heard of other pollutants like mercury, which is a heavy metal that also becomes magnified as it goes up the food chain. Okay, so let's look at some other images. This is an example of the wastewater treatment plant. And one of the things that the wastewater treatment plant can do for the water, if you have sewage put in there, is it can cause an anoxic environment. So here we have already talked about this, but we talked about how this decomposition uses up oxygen, right? And so the dissolved oxygen down from this wastewater sewage plant is low. And so it's not even really a pollutant, but it's because of eutrophication that we have this anoxic, oxygen depleted environment, and that causes issues in our waterways. Okay, another problem with, or another possible a threat to our water systems would be drought. And so would this be number 4? Yes. No, sorry, I have to go back and see where I'm at. Overuse, pollution, and then we have droughts as the third one. So I'll write that up here, drought. So we are expecting, because of climate change, our precipitation patterns to change and our temperature to get hotter and drier in many parts of our country. And so we have to be prepared for how this is going to affect our water supplies. This can be brought on by climate change and changes in precipitation patterns. So we have to be prepared for that and think about how we are going to sustainably use our water, and how it's going to change, right? We're going to have more water in some areas, maybe, and less water in others. And maybe it's going to come at different times of the year. So we could have like a massive downpour or a massive snowstorm in spring, right? So it's going to change. And so we have to think about how this is going to affect our water. One of the problems with drought is that it generally affects surface water. So when our rivers and our streams dry up, the solution oftentimes is to go to the aquifers. So to go into the groundwater. And so here you can see that when we look at the water height, this is the more red, the more negative it is. So we can see that in California, where we have droughts regularly, we see that the aquifer in California is decreasing quite substantially. So then we have this feedback on the overuse of an unsustainable water resource. And so that is another threat. So what can we do to help with clean water? We can regulate its use. And so one of the things that we could talk about is permitting. So we could regulate water use through permits. and also fines, right? So we can allow some industrial processes to pollute up to a point. And if they over pollute, or if they don't have a permit for it, then they have a fine, right? So it's important because of how precious this resource is for us all, and how we need to realize that probably water is a human right. So instead of relying upon our ability to buy clean water from the grocery store in plastic bottles, we need to make sure that everybody has a clean source of water. So one example of this was with Nestle and Crystal Geyser recently in Washington and Oregon and in the Columbia Gorge. So this company came in and they wanted to use the spring water near Cascade Locks to bottle spring water. And the government, and through input from the public, they said no, because these corporations go into places, and they're historically, they go into places and they bottle the spring water, for example, and then that dries up that source of water. So spring water is groundwater, it's coming up from the ground. So we denied the industry, the bottled water industry, rights to that source of water. And so that would be an example of regulating the use of water. We could also give permits to agriculture, right? That they can withdraw so much water for the agriculture, but they might also be another way to help conserve water is to give incentives, right? So we can provide incentives for sustainable use. And this is actually the last principle of sustainability, right? Is providing incentives, right? So an example of this would have been when we do the farm bills, we might provide a incentive to farmers to prevent pollution runoff, right? So the Farm Bill, which is a regulation, it's a legislation, right? Provides incentives. This is an example to farmers to prevent pollution runoff. And finally, another way, so this is like things that we could do to help create sustainability in our water systems, is we could think of this as a system perspective. So we could actually write up here, creating sustainable water practices. Boom, boom. Okay, so we could think like a system. Oops. Right, so a systems perspective. This, I think, is the third, or actually the second principle of sustainability in your textbook. And so this is the idea, is that we have, again, storages and we have flows, right? And so we can think about how we might be able to keep water, surface water, clean water in a system. So a good example of this is creating rivers and streams that have lots of wetland and that might not be so straight and fast flowing. So an example would be to create healthy waterways with lots of storages. And in this case, also the storages would be, for example, the wetlands. So we take streams, sometimes we think it's best for them to be straight, right? But as they move through and they're straight, they cause a lot of erosion, right? And that actually and the water is moving more quickly through the environment. So one way to do this is to create areas, barriers, and to almost think like a beaver. So creating little barriers where it blocks the water and the water backs up and then it's stored in the wetlands, for example, and then it could run off, but it could meander. So creating these healthy streams and river waterways is thinking like a system. So thinking about how water flows through the environment, where it can be stored in the environment, and how important that is because that water could eventually sink back down and become groundwater. If it stays in the surface long enough, it's going to create and replenish some of the groundwater. So those are some things, some of the ideas that I came up with sustainable ways of using water.